Welcome to today's Crosspoint Devotion. I hope you're having a great week. Today I want to talk about a subject that you may not really enjoy. It's called sin. Do you have any sin issues in your life? The reason I want to talk about sin is I think sometimes we minimize the power of sin in our life. Sometimes we even deceive ourselves into thinking that we're not sinful people. And so the real question I think we need to grapple with is, how do we recognize sin? There are a lot of things in the world that are happening around us that try to make us desensitized to discovering the sin that might be in our own life. And so that has led me to ask, how do you know if you're sinning? Well, sometimes it is that the people we're friends with like to point out our sin, and that's how we found out we've sinned. Maybe you're married and you've got a spouse, and when you do something that is sinful, your spouse is able to say to you, that's sin. Or they just at least say, you shouldn't have done that. And you've sinned. Sometimes we may have a guilty conscience that comes from within us and lets us know that we've sinned. For example, you've done something that was maybe wrong, or it was a little bit unethical, or maybe it was even immoral. And after you committed that act or said those words or did whatever it was, you felt guilty. And it's because God has wired our hearts with a little bit of a moral compass that reminds us we've done something wrong. And so it could be your own guilty conscience reminds you that you've sinned. Sometimes we try to find sin based on some rules in the Bible. They're called laws. And whenever we violate one of those laws that God has given us, or those rules that God has laid out in His Word, we know that we've sinned. But maybe the best way that we often overlook to discover our sin is to be in the presence of God. Do you know that when you and I are in the presence of God and we see His holiness and we see His righteousness and we see His impeccable character, and then we look at our own lives in light of seeing who He is, we're reminded very quickly, oh, I am a sinner and I am not worthy to be here. There was a guy in the Old Testament who had an experience very similar to that. His name was Isaiah. We know him as a great prophet, but one of the reasons I think he was a great prophet is Isaiah constantly recognized his sinfulness against the holiness of God. And that's really recorded for us in Isaiah chapter 6. I want to read just a few verses to remind you of how Isaiah came into the presence of God. And when he saw God's holiness, he immediately recognized his own sinfulness. Now here's how it's recorded for us. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of His robe filled the entire temple. Now what you might want to know before we go any further is that Isaiah and King Uzziah, it appears, had a pretty good relationship. And that was kind of rare for a prophet to have a good relationship with a king. Most of the prophets in the Old Testament had an adversarial relationship with the kings. Most of the time, God was sending the prophets to say to the kings, you're sinful, you're not leading the people correctly. You are actually worshiping false gods. And so those prophets had adversarial relationships with the king. But in this case, King Uzziah was a pretty good king. He tried to love the Lord his God. And as a result, Isaiah was his close friend, and they didn't have an adversarial relationship, they had a good relationship. So when King Uzziah died, here's Isaiah, brokenhearted, and he's wondering what's next. And he enters into the place of worship, and he sees the Lord. Then it says in verse 2, seraphs were standing above him. They each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And they called to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of armies. His glory fills the whole earth. In that moment, Isaiah got a real good glimpse of who God was. And the thing that he saw was holy, holy, holy. Anytime something is repeated 3 times in the Old Testament, it is overemphasizing the quality that is being mentioned. So when these angelic beings spoke and said, holy, 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 it was unmistakable to Isaiah. He's in the presence of a holy God. And what was his response when he saw God? It's verse 4. The foundations of the doorway shook at the sound of their voices, and the temple was filled with smoke. And verse 5 says, Then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and live among a people of unclean lips, and because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of armies. Isaiah recognized his sinfulness because he was in the presence of a holy God. If you want to discover how sinful you are, you need to be in the presence of God more often. Yeah, there are people around you who can point out your sin. Sometimes your moral conscience will remind you of your sin. Sometimes you'll know you've violated the laws or the rules that God has outlined in His Word, and you'll know you're a sinful person. But the best way to discover your sin is to be in the presence of a holy God. Let me encourage you to go to His presence, discover His holiness, find out your sinfulness, confess your sin through Jesus Christ, seek His forgiveness, and it'll restore you into a path called righteousness. Well, I hope that'll encourage you as you go through your day and your week ahead. Have a great day.